This year, we celebrate the 80th year of our union, our growth from a small union of Tacoma welfare workers into a movement of 47,000. We have grown because our cause is a good one. We have expanded our power in the workplace and the legislature, won respect for the jobs we perform, and looked beyond our union to make our state and country a better place to live in. Our union has a history we can be proud of. Our story begins in 1938 during the Great Depression. The Washington State Welfare Department had been created in 1937 to provide relief and social work to struggling Washingtonians, 1 in 5 of whom was unemployed. The visitors who provided that assistance worked a grueling schedule. Evenings without extra pay, 7-day weeks, and just 2 days off a year. Neville Crippen, a welfare department visitor in Tacoma, decided to gather his coworkers and organize as Local 53 with a new union, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, which united 20 locals across the country. When Neville and his coworkers in Local 53 began making their mark, workers at the State Highways Department, Labor and Industries, institutions, and Human Services began forming their own locals with AFSCME. In 1943, 80 years ago, these locals united together as Council 28 of AFSCME, taking on the name the Washington Federation of State Employees. Statewide cooperation and coordination and the hiring of our first executive director, Norm Scott, allowed the union to grow, and membership grew along with our wins. Retirement benefits, a 40-hour work week for institutions workers, industrial insurance coverage, and Social Security coverage. But there could be no real dignity for Washington's public workers until we toppled the most hated facet of working in the public sector, the spoils system. Under the spoils system, newly elected governors would fire most state employees from the previous administration and replace them with political supporters, friends, and family members. Governors openly solicited employees for campaign contributions, and employees complied in the hopes of keeping their jobs. Anything could get you fired. Workers were afraid to use their vacation time, let alone speak out about poor working conditions. Union meetings were held in secret. To secure the most fundamental rights, we needed a system where state employees were hired and evaluated based on their merit, not on their political allegiance. Unsurprisingly, neither political party would champion our cause. So we took the issue directly to the people, collecting over 100,000 signatures to get Initiative 207 on the 1960 ballot, flying the last required signatures from Seattle to the Capitol on the deadline day. Local 443 member and state Capitol gardener Joe Lewis arranged for the helicopter to be landed on the Capitol lawn. Civil service reform passed, providing a baseline of rights in our workplaces that we began to build on.
Our next fight was civil rights. Since our earliest years, WFSE members have understood that economic justice and social justice are inseparable. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "What good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger?" Even before AFSCME established a committee for civil rights at the international level, WFSE had one to fight workplace discrimination in Washington through the Civil Rights Committee, which lives on today as the WFSE Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. Its first chairman was Walter Hundley, who had been hired as the first black counselor at the Monroe Correctional Complex in the late 1950s, and become president of its local, WFSE Local 452.
Things were just beginning to seethe a bit in the cauldron of civil rights in the cities across the country, but they really hadn't come to a boil. It wasn't the big issue that it became later. And the Union was really ahead of most other institutions of America at that time. So I was proud of that.
Under Hundley, the committee made sure that anyone could find fair pay, dignity, and respect in Washington's public sector. To expand our union's civil rights work nationwide, WFSE Executive Director Norm Scott joined several other AFSCME activists in founding CORE, the Committee on Union Responsibility. Scott and CORE's mission was to turn AFSCME from a civil service-focused reform organization representing primarily rural, white-collar workers into a militant, collective bargaining-focused union that would aggressively organize blue-collar workers and lend its muscle to the civil rights movement. Scott and CORE accomplished this transformation in 1964 by propelling Jerry Werf, the radical president of AFSCME's District Council 37 in New York City, to the position of AFSCME International President. AFSCME became organized labor's most enthusiastic supporter of the civil rights movement. In 1965, a special AFSCME convention rewrote AFSCME's constitution and included a Bill of Rights for union members, a first in the American labor movement. The melding of labor rights and civil rights was most dramatically expressed in fighting for the dignity of Memphis sanitation workers in 1968. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated while in Memphis, bolstering the striking AFSCME workers.
But let me say to you tonight that whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity and is for the building of humanity, it has dignity and it has worth.
Thanks to WFSE activists like Hundley and Scott, by the end of the 1960s, AFSCME had succeeded in interracial organizing where others had failed. A third of AFSCME's members were black, dwarfing even the most progressive unions like the United Auto Workers. As a member-run organization, this diversity was reflected in our union's leadership. At the 1972 AFSCME convention, it was WFSE who nominated William Lucy to the post of AFSCME's Secretary-Treasurer, a post that made him the highest-ranking black official in any major union in the country. The sense that WFSE had a higher social purpose than simple material benefits was cemented in the civil rights movement. It firmly allied us with other unions seeking justice inside and outside the workplace, and positioned us to play a leading role in the coming struggle for women's equality.
The Equal Pay Act, signed into law by JFK in 1963, made it illegal to pay men and women different wages if they were doing the same job. But what if the jobs were different and the woman was paid less even though her work was just as valuable as the man's? Winning this kind of pay equity was a much higher bar. Thankfully, we had some experience in the area. In the 1960s, we'd won significant pay raises for attendants and nurses, primarily women, at state psychiatric hospitals who were paid less than painters and carpenters, by arguing that workers should be paid on the basis of how important their job was to the mission and the role of that institution. To expand this kind of calculation to all WFSE members' jobs, we pushed for a statewide study that assigned numerical scores to the key facets of 121 male and female-dominated jobs. If the metrics showed two jobs, a secretary and a maintenance worker, for example, had comparable worth, then they should be paid the same. The results of the study were conclusive. Women were paid 20% less than men for work of comparable worth. In one example, a clerk typist and a warehouse worker 1 both received scores of 94. But clerk typists were paid 10 salary ranges below the warehouse workers. For some, the results were a revelation. For many women, they confirmed what had been obvious all along. Their contributions were systematically undervalued. But these historic findings came at an inopportune time. During the late 1970s, anti-worker billionaires and corporations blamed rising unemployment and inflation on public sector workers and their unions in an effort to reduce their taxes and maximize their profits. Billionaire-funded think tanks like the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and eventually the Freedom Foundation sold trickle-down economics to the public and many elected officials. If you just cut government budgets and gave more money to billionaires, the theory went, everyone would benefit. Never mind that empowering workers in unions and investing in public services had created the middle class. Funding for a comparable worth implementation dried up, so WFSE went on the offensive. We won the first voluntary deductions for people, our union's political action program, in 1978 to ensure that working families could compete with moneyed interests in politics. After 2 lawsuits seeking action on comparable worth failed, WFSE members wrote letters, made phone calls, and held rallies to win a key ally, Governor Booth Gardner, who agreed to negotiate a settlement with our union in 1985. WFSE Executive Director George Maston served as lead negotiator and won a settlement of $482 million and significant pay raises for 35,000 workers. A quick glance at how the plaintiffs in the lawsuit benefited from the decision drove home the significance of the win. Willie Mae Willis, a food service worker 2 at the University of Washington, Seattle, saw her monthly salary increase from $1,087 to $1,614, a 67% increase in pay. To this day, new state employees continue to benefit from these massive increases to their base pay.
Next, we turned our attention to an elusive goal: full-scope collective bargaining, the ability to directly bargain with our employers over our pay. To that point, the only way to get raises was through what we called collective begging, submitting economic requests directly to the legislature, which could ignore or change our proposals as they saw fit. Our contracts covered workplace conditions only. Delegates to our 1988 convention unanimously voted to pursue full-scope collective bargaining, and every convention thereafter renewed the commitment as numerous bills fizzled out in the legislature or met unsympathetic governors. The matter came to a head in 2001 when our luck with collective begging ran out. Faced with program cuts, unfair pay, and drastic hikes to our healthcare costs, WFSE engaged in its first ever strike during the 2001 legislative session. While Washington public workers have no legal right to strike, there is also no law establishing penalties for striking. If the strike threatens public safety, Washington's Attorney General can declare it illegal and attempt to stop it through an injunction. So, we opted to engage in a rolling strike, hitting specific targets with one-day work stoppages to protect the public and reduce the likelihood of an injunction. At 24/7 institutions and critical care facilities, skeleton crews remained on the job to provide vital services like feeding, bathing, and clothing, and those on the picket line carried pagers or walkie-talkies so they could be called back inside if an emergency arose. The first day of the strike, April 18th, 5 work sites struck, including Department of Agriculture grain elevators adjacent ports in Vancouver, Kalama, and Tacoma, where dock workers represented by ILWU refused to cross our picket lines. Day 2 focused on state institutions and included 13 work stoppages. Day 3 included 24 actions with a focus on higher education, a general strike at the state capitol, and a 5-mile march ending at the Capitol. On Day 4, we rallied with union siblings from the wider world of organized labor and AFSCME President McEntee on the Capitol lawn. Despite a successful first week, the legislature failed to come to an agreement on a final budget at the end of the legislative session on April 22nd. Settling in for a long strike, we began knocking on doors in the districts of key legislators before the legislature reconvened for a special session in May. Despite 28 strike actions over the first 2 weeks of May and a statewide work stoppage that brought many state agencies to a standstill, the first special session ended without a final budget. During a second special legislative session in June, we shifted our focus to direct pressure on holdout legislators, knocking on doors and placing thousands of calls to the legislative hotline. Finally, the House met our demands: a fair pay raise, a reduction in healthcare costs, and other improvements. WFSE members packed the galleries during a Senate vote, and the budget passed. We'd won our economic demands, avoided an unfavorable court ruling that would put our ability to strike in the future in jeopardy, and convinced the legislature to seriously reconsider our bills for full-scope collective bargaining. The following year, during the 2002 legislative session, we won. WFSE members finally had an active role and a final say in their economic futures. In 2004, WFSE members negotiated and ratified their first full-scope collective bargaining agreements. With this major hurdle behind us, our union has continued to push the envelope and expand bargaining rights to more workers. Though our progress has been threatened in recent years by coordinated attacks on working people's rights to join together in strong unions, including the 2018 billionaire bankrolled Janus v. AFSCME U.S. Supreme Court decision, Washington's public workers have continued to empower themselves with a collective bargaining agreement through WFSE. Assistant Attorneys General, environmental workers at the King and Thurston County Conservation Districts, administrative law judges, professional staff at the Office of the Attorney General and the Pierce County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, L&I interpreters, advisors at South Puget Sound Community College, and staff at the Office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing have all said, "Union, yes."
Two years after the Janus decision, we faced our next test when COVID-19 arrived in Washington state. By organizing on the ground and winning at the negotiating table, we made sure that our members didn't have to choose between their safety and providing for their families. We set the standard for what organized labor could accomplish during a pandemic, pushing back on furloughs and cuts, keeping our universities, medical facilities, and communities running, and winning important workplace protections that were then extended to workers across the state. Our members didn't just fight for public safety, they served as a financial lifeline. When Washington was hit with a historic surge in unemployment claims, WFSE members at the Employment Security Department worked the phones 12 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week to ensure workers got the help they needed. With a strong union at their back, WFSE members helped Washington achieve one of the lowest COVID fatality rates in the nation. Our members were rightly hailed as heroes, but then, suddenly, we found ourselves rowing against the current. Washington's budget projections fell off a cliff. A chorus of voices, including the editorial board of the Seattle Times and, you guessed it, anti-worker billionaires and their think tanks, called on the governor to reopen our contracts, cancel previously negotiated raises, and make bold cuts to the services we provide. It's true. Economists warned that we were facing a Great Depression-sized crisis. But beyond the obvious ethical problem with disinvesting in the very people and services that were helping Washington get through the pandemic, it didn't make economic sense. As we learned during the Great Recession, reductions in government spending on wages and services actually hurt the economy. Our union spoke up, protecting previously negotiated raises in launching the largest educational campaign in our union's history, the Put People First campaign. Participants learned how to communicate a vision for adequately funded jobs and a fair revenue system to elected officials and the public. Always a priority, the need for a fair tax structure that holds the mega-wealthy accountable became clearer than ever during the pandemic. While state revenue plunged, billionaire profits skyrocketed. And because Washington has the most unfair tax system of any state in the nation, most of those profits would not go towards our jobs when our communities needed us the most. The campaign worked. Against the odds, we negotiated 21-23 contracts with no cuts, preserving yearly step increases and maintaining our healthcare costs, a major accomplishment when the numbers said we should be looking at 30% workforce reductions. A few months later, when the economy began to recover, 6,000 WFSE members wrote letters to convince Governor Inslee to reopen our contracts, not for a cut, but for an unprecedented mid-contract raise that put us on solid footing to negotiate our 2023-2025 contracts. After months of negotiations and worksite actions, members ratified 2023-25 contracts that went down as the largest in our union's history, addressing significant pay and safety issues and mending gaping holes in our safety net. In 1956, shortly after being elected to his second stint as WFSE president, Neville Crippen said, "Our yesterdays prepare us for today." He'd seen our union overcome our underground formative years and financial struggles. They'd found their footing and were gearing up to take on the spoils system. His words remain true today. In just the past 5 years, our union has faced and overcome obstacles that could have broken us, but they didn't. We've inherited a rich history. We were prepared for today, and we're prepared for tomorrow. No project is too great that we can't accomplish it. We are history-built, future-bound.